Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I always knew where I stood in my family. My younger sister, Olivia, was the undisputed favorite. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Brilliant, beautiful, and obedient. She was everything our parents wanted in a child. I, on the other hand, was the family's constant disappointment, a source of quiet frustration and unspoken disapproval. Our parents were first-generation immigrants who had built a successful construction company from the ground up. They embodied the immigrant dream, and their story was one of grit and sacrifice. To them, success meant stability, doctor, lawyer, or engineer. Olivia fit their mold perfectly, choosing a career in medicine and graduating with honors. Meanwhile, I gravitated toward fashion and retail, a path they saw as frivolous and unbecoming of their hard-earned status. The favoritism wasn't just subtle, it was glaring. When I earned straight A's in high school, they'd remind me that Olivia was taking advanced placement courses. When I got into a reputable business school, they'd counter with Olivia's acceptance into medical school. Every achievement of mine was overshadowed by one of hers, and their disappointment was palpable. After college, I started at the bottom, working as a sales associate at a major retail chain. My parents saw it as further proof of my failure. My dad's comment still echoes in my head. "You went to college to work in a store?" His words stung, but I didn't let them derail me. What they failed to understand was that this wasn't just a job. It was my education. Over the next 5 years, I climbed the ranks, moving from sales associate to inventory manager, then to assistant store manager, and eventually to regional manager. Along the way, I absorbed everything I could about the retail business: supply chains, merchandising, customer behavior, staffing, and operations. On weekends, I threw myself into design workshops, honing my skills and networking with suppliers. Every spare dollar went into developing my clothing line. I was methodical and patient, crafting a business plan that accounted for every detail. By the time I was 28, I had saved $100,000, enough to take the leap and launch my brand. 2 years ago, I decided it was time. I found the perfect location in an up-and-coming neighborhood, secured preliminary agreements with suppliers, and lined up potential employees. The only missing piece was additional capital. Banks and local investors offered some funding, but it wasn't enough to do things right. Reluctantly, I turned to my parents. Despite our strained relationship, I knew they had the resources to help. A small part of me hoped they might finally see my potential. To my surprise, they seemed genuinely interested. My dad spent hours going through my business plan, making suggestions, and even introducing me to a few of his contacts. My mom started bragging to her friends about her entrepreneurial son, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. They agreed to invest $500,000 for a 30% stake in the business, and for 6 months, it seemed like things were finally turning around. Then Olivia got involved. It started with a family meeting, one she called under the guise of concern. Sitting in our parents' living room, she launched into a detailed critique of my business plan. "Retail is a dying industry," she said confidently. "Online shopping is the future, and your model is outdated." Her critique wasn't just casual, it was calculated. She had prepared slides, charts, and articles to support her claims. She talked about declining foot traffic in malls, the dominance of e-commerce giants, and the risks of opening a brick-and-mortar store. She even hired a consultant to write a scathing assessment of my plan. "This isn't personal," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I just don't want to see you fail." My dad, swayed by her polished presentation, suggested I reconsider my plans. "Maybe you should listen to Olivia," he said. My mom chimed in, offering an alternative. "What about healthcare administration? Olivia could help you get started." I reminded them that I had already quit my job, paid a $25,000 non-refundable deposit on the retail space, and signed preliminary contracts with suppliers. My dad shrugged, his tone indifferent. "Maybe your boss will take you back if you apologize." Their betrayal stung more than I cared to admit. But it was Olivia's smug expression that pushed me over the edge. She sat there, arms crossed, a slight smile tugging at her lips. She didn't just doubt me, she wanted me to fail. I left that night with a fire in my chest. If they weren't going to believe in me, fine. I didn't need their money or their approval. I'd build this business without them, and prove them all wrong. When my parents backed out, I was left staring at a financial abyss. The $25,000 I'd paid for the retail space was non-refundable, and I had contracts with suppliers that wouldn't wait. For a brief moment, I considered throwing in the towel. But every time I thought about Olivia's smug, self-righteous face, my resolve hardened. If my family didn't believe in me, I'd find someone who did, or I'd succeed alone. The first step was to scrape together the money. I maxed out every credit card I owned, took out high-interest personal loans, and even sold my car, opting to use public transportation. Then I reached out to my network, former colleagues, old friends, even distant acquaintances. A few pitched in small amounts, offering what they could because they believed in me, not just my business. The real turning point came when I met Peter, a local angel investor. Peter had built a chain of successful retail stores and knew the industry inside out. He saw the potential in my designs and my obsessive attention to detail. "You're going places," he told me after reviewing my pitch. He invested $250,000 for a 20% stake and offered me guidance in navigating the early challenges of launching a brand. With Peter's support, I went all in. Those first few months were nothing short of brutal. I worked 16-hour days, slept on a cheap mattress in my office to save money, and juggled every role imaginable. I was the manager, the cashier, the janitor, the delivery driver, and even the social media manager. There was no room for error and no time to rest. The store opened with a modest inventory, but the response was beyond what I could have hoped for. Customers loved the unique, high-quality designs that set my brand apart from generic retail chains. Influencers began posting about us without me even asking, drawn by the authenticity of the brand. Within 6 months, we were turning a profit. By the end of the first year, we'd exceeded every projection. Our revenue grew by 200%, and demand was so high that I opened a second location. On top of that, our e-commerce store became a major success, with orders pouring in from across the country. Despite the business's success, I kept my distance from my parents. They didn't know about the second location or the thriving online store. Part of me wanted to wait until I could confront them and force them to see how wrong they'd been. Then, out of the blue, they walked into my flagship store. It was a quiet weekday morning. I was in the middle of a staff meeting when I saw them stroll through the store like casual shoppers, examining the displays. My dad stopped to admire a mannequin in the front window, while my mom marveled at the layout. They were acting like proud parents at a science fair, except they hadn't earned the right to be here. I stepped out to meet them, keeping my tone neutral. "What are you doing here?" "This is incredible," my dad said, a wide smile on his face. "We always knew you'd pull it off." It took everything in me not to laugh. They doubted me at every turn, pulled their support when I needed it most, and now they were acting like they'd been rooting for me all along. When they asked to speak privately, I agreed out of sheer curiosity. Seated in my office, they didn't waste time. My dad cleared his throat and launched into his pitch. "We want to invest," he said, his tone confident. $1 million for a 30% stake. "We've been watching your success, and it's clear this is going to be big. We can make this a real family business," my mom added, her voice soft and nostalgic. "Think of what we could do together." I leaned back in my chair and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You're kidding, right? 2 years ago, you didn't think this was worth anything. Now you want in." My dad's smile faltered. "We had concerns, but it's clear you've proven yourself." "You mean after Olivia convinced you to pull out and almost ruined me?" I shot back. "I don't need you now. And frankly, I don't trust you." My mom's face crumpled as she started to cry. "How can you say that? We're your family." "You had your chance," I said firmly. "You walked away. You don't get to come back now that I'm successful." My dad's face turned red with anger. "You're being arrogant. We're offering you a way to take this to the next level, and I'm saying no," I replied, standing up to signal the end of the conversation. "You can leave now." They stormed out, my mom sobbing and my dad muttering something about ungrateful children. As the door closed behind them, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. For the first time in my life, I was the one with the power, and I wasn't going to let them take it away. Rejecting my parents' offer wasn't just a blow to them. It was a direct affront to Olivia's self-proclaimed status as the family's golden child. By the very next day, she'd mobilized to turn the extended family against me. At every family gathering, Olivia spun a narrative in which I was the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his parents in their time of need. She painted herself as the dutiful daughter, lamenting how my arrogance had driven a wedge between us. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started texting me, asking why I couldn't forgive and forget, or accusing me of letting success go to my head. But Olivia didn't stop at family. She tracked down old high school friends on social media, feeding them exaggerated tales of how I'd betrayed the values we'd been raised with. "He thinks he's better than all of us now," one former friend relayed to me after cutting ties with her. The final straw came when she began targeting my business. Olivia reached out to my partners and suppliers, posing as a concerned sibling who wanted to help. In emails and LinkedIn messages, she offered what she called valuable insights into my business and claimed her connections to influencers through her dermatology practice could take my brand to the next level. She was so bold as to suggest meetings with some of my investors, implying she had a stake in the company. I immediately involved my lawyer, who sent Olivia a cease and desist letter. But it was clear she wouldn't back down easily. While Olivia waged her smear campaign, my parents doubled down on their efforts. They began showing up at my stores during peak hours, disrupting business with their theatrics. My dad would loudly berate me about respecting my elders, while my mom cried in the corner, drawing stares from customers and employees alike. One Saturday afternoon, they marched into my flagship store, loudly lamenting how I'd forgotten my roots. It wasn't just personal harassment, they escalated legally. My dad sent his corporate lawyer to my office with an offer to buy a 40% stake in my company, claiming it was only fair compensation for their guidance during the early days of planning. My lawyer responded with a warning. Any further attempts to insert themselves into my business would result in legal action. The pressure from my family started to seep into the workplace. Employees whispered about the drama, and some worried it might destabilize the company. To address the situation, I called an all-hands meeting. I assured my team that the issues with my family wouldn't affect operations or their jobs. This is a distraction, nothing more, I told them. We'll handle it, and we'll keep moving forward. Despite the circus, my business thrived. Sales skyrocketed, and our online store saw record-breaking numbers. With the success of our flagship locations, I secured contracts for 2 more stores, bringing us into new cities. The growth was exhilarating, but my family's antics were becoming a distraction I couldn't ignore. My success was the ultimate revenge, but their relentless interference forced me to ask myself, how far were they willing to go, and how much was I willing to tolerate? The shift began with a single message from my cousin Emily. She worked as a nurse at Olivia's hospital and had been following the family drama from the sidelines. But when she reached out, her words were enough to stop me in my tracks. You need to know what's really going on with Olivia. We met for coffee the next day, where Emily revealed the truth about Olivia's cryptocurrency disaster. The $800,000 loss I'd heard about? That was just the tip of the iceberg. Olivia had convinced 15 of her colleagues, including senior doctors and hospital administrators, to invest a combined $2.3 million in what turned out to be a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. She promised them insane returns, Emily said, shaking her head. When it collapsed, she borrowed money from other colleagues to pay back the first wave of investors. It turned into a mini Ponzi scheme of her own. When her juggling act inevitably failed, several of Olivia's colleagues filed formal complaints with the hospital. The administration launched an investigation, and whispers of unprofessional conduct and potential fraud spread through the halls. Olivia's golden reputation was tarnished beyond repair. The bombshells didn't stop there. Emily went on to reveal that Olivia's sabotage of my business pitch 2 years ago wasn't just casual sibling rivalry. It was premeditated. After our parents had shown interest in investing in me, Olivia had secretly hired a consultant using their money. The consultant wrote a scathing review of my business plan, which Olivia then presented to our parents as an independent assessment. She wanted to keep the spotlight on herself, Emily said. It wasn't about protecting them. It was about making sure they didn't have a reason to celebrate you. But what stung most was what came next. 6 months after sabotaging me, Olivia pitched her own business idea to our parents, a chain of luxury medical spas. The plan included combining her dermatology expertise with retail skincare products, a direct competitor to my business model. The irony? Our parents, who had dismissed my dream as a bad investment, turned Olivia down. Their construction company was already struggling, and they couldn't spare the funds. The extent of their financial troubles was worse than I'd imagined. Through business contacts, I learned that my dad's company was facing 6 lawsuits from unpaid contractors. They'd also been accused of using substandard materials on a government project, resulting in an investigation. Their biggest government contract, worth $12 million annually, was up for review, and industry insiders doubted they'd retain it. The company had already laid off a significant portion of its workforce and sold off assets to stay afloat. It was clear now why my parents had suddenly taken an interest in my business. Their desperate attempts to invest weren't about supporting me. They were about saving themselves. Emily's revelations left me both furious and oddly vindicated. Olivia's downfall was of her own making, but it was poetic justice to see the golden child shine fade. The family who had dismissed me as a failure was now drowning in the consequences of their own choices. and the irony wasn't lost on me. The more I uncovered about my family's manipulative behavior, the deeper my anger ran. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about years of neglect, favoritism, and outright betrayal. Cutting ties felt like the only way to move forward. But as I'd soon discover, severing connections with my family would only bring their desperation to new heights. The first blow came from Olivia. Refusing to accept that I wouldn't let her near my business, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One Saturday afternoon, she walked into my flagship store unannounced, acting as if she belonged there. She wore her usual air of authority, casually telling my employees that she was a silent partner and needed access to the back office. I wasn't on site that day, but my manager called me immediately. "Your sister's here," he said, his voice laced with unease. "She's asking for access to the inventory records. She says she's part of the company." "She's lying," I said firmly. "Call security and have her escorted out. Record everything." Minutes later, I got a follow-up call. Olivia had refused to leave quietly. She accused my manager of disrespecting family in front of customers and employees. Security had to physically escort her out as she yelled, "You're going to regret this," loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. The fallout was almost immediate. That evening, my business's Google and Yelp pages were bombarded with fake reviews. The posts made wild claims about terrible customer service, unsanitary conditions, and even fraudulent charges on credit cards. The worst part? Some of the reviews referenced personal details about me, clearly written by someone who knew me. My suspicions were confirmed when Olivia posted a series of cryptic social media updates, saying things like, "Some people don't value family until it's too late," and "Beware of wolves in sheep's clothing." She even tagged me in one post, implying that I was the wolf. The damage wasn't limited to online smear campaigns. Olivia also began reaching out to my suppliers, posing as a concerned insider with important information about our operations. Two of my fabric suppliers called to ask if they should speak with her. Thankfully, they reached out to me first instead of falling for her lies. I immediately sent out a company-wide directive to all partners and vendors. No one in my family is authorized to speak on behalf of the business. Any attempts to contact you should be reported directly to me. To manage the growing mess, I hired a PR firm. They worked tirelessly to remove the fake reviews and combat the misinformation Olivia had spread. The firm also helped craft a public statement addressing the situation without airing too much family drama. While I value family, this business is the product of years of hard work and dedication. No one outside my trusted team has any involvement in its operations, the statement read. I hated that it had come to this, but it was necessary. Olivia's antics weren't just a personal attack. They were threatening my livelihood and the livelihoods of my employees. My parents weren't any better. Their desperation to salvage their failing construction company had reached absurd levels. My dad, unwilling to accept that I'd rejected their investment offer, started spreading rumors. He claimed I had stolen my business ideas from him, citing vague conversations we'd had during my initial pitch 2 years ago. It was a laughable accusation, but it still stung. My mom took a different approach. She leaned into guilt-tripping, calling family members to sob about how I'd abandoned them in their time of need. "We raised him to be better than this," she told anyone who would listen. At family gatherings I refused to attend, she reportedly cried over dinner, lamenting how success had turned me cold and ungrateful. Relatives who had never cared about my career suddenly had strong opinions about my choices. Uncle Robert, who had refused to help me when I was starting out, called to suggest I should make amends for the sake of family unity. My cousin Brianna, one of Olivia's few remaining allies, accused me of being selfish and letting a little money come between me and my loved ones. The breaking point came when Olivia escalated her tactics. After being escorted out of my store, she contacted a local tabloid with a fabricated story about my company exploiting workers and using unsustainable practices. The article didn't gain much traction, but it was enough to cause a ripple of concern among my newer customers. I knew I had to act decisively. My lawyer filed a restraining order against Olivia, barring her from entering any of my properties or contacting my employees, suppliers, or partners. She was also warned that any further attempts to defame my business would result in legal action. Meanwhile, my parents' construction company was in freefall. They lost their biggest government contract due to the ongoing investigation into their use of substandard materials. Contractors who hadn't been paid filed lawsuits, and several banks began calling in their loans. By the end of the quarter, they'd laid off nearly 75% of their workforce and sold their main office building to stay afloat. Rather than owning up to their failures, my dad blamed me. "If you had just let us invest," he said during one of his unwelcome visits to my home, "none of this would have happened." I slammed the door in his face. Olivia's situation wasn't much better. After being placed on indefinite leave by the hospital, she moved back in with our parents. Emily told me she'd become a shell of her former self, spending most days locked in her childhood bedroom, muttering about how unfair life was. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, but I couldn't. Their downfall wasn't something I celebrated. It was a cautionary tale about greed, entitlement, and the consequences of burning bridges. My business, on the other hand, continued to thrive. We'd recently opened our third location, and online sales were at an all-time high. The investor who'd believed in me when no one else did became a trusted mentor, helping me navigate the challenges of rapid growth. Looking back, I realized their betrayal had been a blessing in disguise. If my parents had invested, they would have demanded control, meddling in every decision. By building this business on my own, I'd proven not just to them, but to myself that I was capable of achieving success without their approval. And that, I decided, was the best revenge. With Olivia's web of lies unraveling and my parents' construction empire collapsing, their desperation reached a fever pitch. But instead of taking responsibility for their failures, they doubled down on their narrative. I was the ungrateful son who had abandoned them in their time of need. They spread this tale to anyone who would listen, extended family, old friends, even members of our community who had little connection to us. Family is supposed to stick together. My Aunt Carla lectured over an unsolicited phone call. "You're so caught up in your little business that you've forgotten where you came from." I'd learned not to engage with these guilt trips, but it still stung. For years, I'd bent over backward trying to earn my parents' approval, only to be cast aside whenever Olivia entered the picture. Now that I'd succeeded on my own, they wanted to rewrite history. Their smear campaign went beyond words. My dad's most outrageous move yet came in the form of a letter from his lawyer, accusing me of stealing intellectual property. The letter claimed that because I'd shared my business plans with him during my initial pitch, he was entitled to a portion of my company's profits. It was laughable, but also infuriating. My lawyer, Peter, handled it with his usual calm. "This is a textbook case of grasping at straws," he said after reading the letter. "We'll respond firmly and make it clear that if they push this nonsense any further, we'll counter with a lawsuit for harassment." The legal threats didn't stop my dad from showing up at one of my stores a week later. He approached the cashier, asking to speak with me directly. When my manager intervened and told him to leave, my dad caused a scene, shouting, "He's nothing without his family. This business wouldn't exist if it weren't for me." Security escorted him out, but the damage was done. Customers and employees alike were left shaken. That evening, I sent out a company-wide memo reassuring everyone that these family matters wouldn't affect our operations. I also hired additional security to ensure the safety of my staff and customers. Meanwhile, Olivia's carefully curated image as the perfect daughter was in shambles. The medical board's investigation uncovered years of unethical behavior, including how she'd leveraged her position as a doctor to gain trust for her Ponzi scheme. 5 colleagues filed lawsuits, presenting text messages, emails, and even recorded conversations as evidence. Emily, my cousin at the hospital, told me about Olivia's public meltdown after receiving notice of her suspension. "She was screaming about how unfair it all was," Emily recounted. "Security had to escort her out while she yelled that you were the reason her life was ruined." Hearing this would have angered me a year ago, but now it only made me feel pity. Olivia had spent her entire life basking in our parents' favoritism, never learning how to face consequences. Now that the rug had been pulled out from under her, she had no idea how to stand on her own. She moved back in with our parents shortly after the hospital incident. According to Emily, Olivia rarely left her childhood bedroom, alternating between ranting about her misfortunes and scheming ways to regain her status. "She still thinks she can bounce back," Emily said, "but no one at the hospital trusts her anymore. Her career's over." Despite the chaos swirling around my family, my business continued to flourish. We opened 2 new locations in major cities, and our online store became one of the top-rated platforms for sustainable fashion. Customers resonated with our brand's mission, and the harder my family tried to tarnish my reputation, the more loyal my supporters became. In private moments, though, I couldn't ignore the emotional toll. Cutting ties with my parents and Olivia hadn't been easy. There were times when I missed the idea of family, the Sunday dinners, the shared memories, the sense of belonging. But the reality was that these things had never existed for me the way they had for Olivia. For the first time in my life, I was prioritizing my own well-being over their approval. And as painful as it was, I knew it was the right choice. Peter, my investor-turned-mentor, summed it up best during a business meeting. Success isn't just about money or growth, he said. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone devalue it. You're doing the right thing, even if it feels lonely right now. His words stayed with me as I navigated this new chapter of independence. My family's chaos might never fully disappear, but it no longer controlled me. For the first time, I felt free, not just from their expectations, but from the need to prove myself to anyone but me. As my business flourished, the lengths my parents and Olivia were willing to go to disrupt it reached absurd levels. They started contacting my suppliers and partners, claiming to have authority over the company. It began with subtle insinuations, requests for information, inquiries about supply agreements, but soon escalated into outright lies. 2 of my fabric suppliers called me directly, concerned about emails they'd received from Olivia, who claimed to be a partner in my business. She said she was overseeing operations and wanted updates on order volumes, one supplier explained. She's not involved in any capacity, I replied firmly. I immediately sent notices to all my vendors, clarifying that no family member had any connection to my business. Though I managed to contain the damage, the incident highlighted just how dangerous their interference had become. My lawyer, Peter, urged me to take decisive action. We've dealt with harassment, forgery, and false claims, he said, laying out a file thick with evidence. It's time to file restraining orders against your parents and Olivia. This isn't just toxic behavior, it's sabotage. Filing restraining orders felt extreme, but I was out of options. The final straw came when Olivia showed up at one of my stores unannounced, claiming she needed to discuss operational changes with the manager. Security quickly escorted her out, but not before she caused a scene in the parking lot, screaming about how I was ruining her life. Days later, the situation escalated further. A bank contacted me to verify a loan application in Olivia's name. She had forged documents, claiming to be a partner in my company and providing falsified financial statements to secure the loan. Thankfully, the bank flagged the discrepancies and reached out before processing the application. Peter added this incident to the growing pile of evidence against her. We'll include the forgery in the restraining order filings, he said. And if they keep pushing, we'll pursue legal action. Even my extended family began to see the cracks in their facade. My cousin Emily, who had exposed Olivia's Ponzi scheme, became one of my strongest allies. At a family gathering, she confronted our parents in front of everyone, delivering a blunt accusation. You're enabling Olivia and trying to exploit him. You only want his money. And it's disgusting. Her words reverberated through the room, and for the first time, I felt a shift. Relatives who had previously stayed neutral began distancing themselves from my parents and Olivia. The tide was turning, and their support system was crumbling. But just when I thought things couldn't get more absurd, I uncovered an even darker secret. Through a mutual business contact, I learned that my dad's construction company was under federal investigation. They had been using substandard materials on a multi-million-dollar government project, endangering both their reputation and public safety. The penalties they faced were astronomical: potential criminal charges, massive fines, and the loss of their professional licenses. Their desperation to secure a stake in my business suddenly made sense. They weren't just trying to ride the coattails of my success. They were trying to save themselves from financial ruin. As I pieced it all together, I realized just how far my family had fallen. They weren't just a toxic influence. They were a liability, and they were willing to destroy everything I'd built to escape their self-inflicted disaster. Now, it wasn't just about protecting my business. It was about protecting myself. As my parents' business crumbled and Olivia's reputation imploded, my own life soared to new heights. The sustainable fashion line I had poured my heart into launched with overwhelming success. Influencers loved our commitment to ethical production, and the brand caught the attention of major fashion magazines. Features in publications like Vogue and Elle catapulted us into a new league, and our sales skyrocketed. Peter, my angel investor, became not just a mentor, but a trusted friend. He guided me through the complexities of scaling a business, from negotiating with manufacturers to managing store expansions. Your vision brought us here, he told me during one of our strategy meetings. But discipline will keep us here. With his advice, we opened 3 new flagship stores in major cities, solidifying our presence in key markets. Our partnership with eco-friendly manufacturers further strengthened the brand's identity. Customers appreciated that we weren't just about fashion. We were about values. Every milestone felt like a triumph, not just over my past, but over the doubts and dismissals I had faced for years. Yet, even as my success grew, the shadow of my family lingered. My parents, desperate and grasping, attempted one last gambit. Through their lawyer, they sent a letter claiming that I owed them a portion of my company's success because they had mentally committed to investing years ago. The absurdity of the claim almost made me laugh. They'd actively sabotaged me, abandoned me when I needed them, and now they wanted credit for my accomplishments? My lawyer crafted a response that was as concise as it was definitive, a cease and desist letter, coupled with a warning that any further harassment would lead to legal action. Olivia, predictably, doubled down on her antics. She began spreading rumors that my entire business model was copied from concepts she had suggested in casual family conversations. It was baseless, of course, but it infuriated me. My team and I had worked tirelessly to build this brand from the ground up, and her lies felt like an insult to everything we'd achieved. On a personal level, however, my life had never been better. Brianna, my girlfriend of 3 years, and I got engaged in a small, intimate ceremony at home. Brianna, a marketing executive with her own impressive career, had been my anchor throughout this ordeal. She understood my family's toxicity and encouraged me to focus on the life we were building together. When word of the engagement reached my parents, they launched a new campaign to insert themselves into my life. They called wedding venues, claiming to be involved in planning, and even reached out to Brianna's parents, trying to force a connection. Fortunately, Brianna and I were one step ahead. We had chosen a destination wedding in another country, with a guest list limited to close friends and chosen family. My parents had no idea where it would be, and their efforts to infiltrate the celebration were futile. For the first time in years, I felt free. My life was no longer defined by their manipulation or Olivia's schemes. I had my business, my partner, and a future filled with promise. The chaos they had brought into my life was finally fading into the background, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't known I needed. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Olivia's downward spiral hit its inevitable conclusion when the state formally charged her with multiple counts of fraud. The evidence was damning. Forged documents, emails promising impossible returns, and testimony from the colleagues she had deceived. 5 doctors filed civil suits to recoup their losses, and the medical board suspended her license indefinitely. In the courtroom, Olivia's facade crumbled. Gone was the composed, confident doctor. In her place was a desperate woman grasping at excuses. She blamed everyone but herself, her colleagues for being too trusting, her superiors for not recognizing her stress, and of course me. She stole my family's support. She cried during a private conversation with Emily, according to my cousin. If they'd backed me like they backed him, none of this would have happened. One particularly bold move came when Olivia attempted to contact Brianna. In a rambling voicemail, she begged my fiancé to convince me to make things right by offering her a stake in my business or helping her with legal fees. Brianna didn't even dignify it with a response. She blocked Olivia immediately. While Olivia's reputation was in shreds, my parents weren't faring much better. Their company lost its final government contract, and the lawsuits over substandard materials reached a boiling point. Facing millions in fines and legal fees, they were forced to sell their home and move into a modest rental property in a less desirable neighborhood. Despite their own role in their downfall, my parents clung to their narrative of victimhood. At every family gathering, they spread the same story. I had abandoned them in their darkest hour. My mother cried about how she had sacrificed everything for me, only to be betrayed when she needed help the most. Their efforts to guilt-trip me backfired spectacularly. Extended family members who had initially believed them began to see through the lies, especially as more details about Olivia's sabotage came to light. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to express their shock at how blatantly I'd been targeted, and their admiration for how I had risen above it. Through it all, I remained laser-focused on my business and the life I was building with Brianna. I stopped attending family gatherings and cut off anyone who tried to mediate between me and my parents. My energy was better spent on expanding my brand and cherishing the people who had supported me from the start. The final straw with Olivia came when she forged yet another document, this time claiming I owed her royalties for a non-existent partnership. The audacity of her actions was almost laughable, but I wasn't taking any chances. My lawyer presented the evidence in court, securing a permanent restraining order against her. As I signed the paperwork, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I was truly free from their influence, No more manipulation, no more sabotage, no more guilt. Olivia and my parents had gambled on the idea that I would always need them, that I'd eventually come crawling back. But I'd built something stronger, something they could never take from me. Independence, success, and a future that was entirely my own. For the first time, I felt untouchable. 6 months after the chaos subsided, life had transformed into something I could only have dreamed of during those early, grueling days of building my business. Our brand had expanded beyond national borders, breaking into international markets with partnerships that seemed like a distant fantasy just 2 years prior. The sustainable fashion line gained recognition in eco-conscious circles, and major media outlets were covering our story. We weren't just successful, we were thriving with a future that felt limitless. On a personal front, Brianna and I had just returned from our honeymoon. We'd gotten married in a serene seaside ceremony, attended by friends, loyal colleagues, and the few family members who had stood by me throughout. It was intimate, joyful, and filled with love, the exact opposite of the environment I'd grown up in. My parents and Olivia, of course, weren't invited. I didn't miss their presence, nor did I feel bitterness. Instead, there was a quiet peace in knowing that the people who mattered most were there, celebrating not just our union, but also the life we were building together, a life free from toxicity and manipulation. From time to time, I'd hear about my parents and Olivia through distant relatives. Olivia was still living with my parents, embroiled in the lawsuits her former colleagues had filed against her. Her medical career was effectively over, and rumors swirled about how she spent most days wallowing in bitterness and self-pity. My parents weren't faring much better. My dad's construction company had shuttered completely, and he was reportedly working small consulting gigs to keep afloat. My mom, once the queen of social gatherings, had retreated from public life entirely. She couldn't face the scrutiny and whispered questions about how the once proud family had fallen so far. I felt no schadenfreude, only detachment. Their downfall was a consequence of their own actions, and I was no longer a part of their story. Looking back, I realized that their betrayal had been the greatest gift they could have given me. If they had invested in my business, they would have tried to control it, forcing their opinions and influence on decisions I needed to make independently. Their rejection had compelled me to seek support from those who truly believed in me, and most importantly, to believe in myself. The journey hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, anger, and exhaustion when I questioned whether I could pull it off. But those moments shaped me, building resilience and grit that no amount of money or favoritism could have provided. As Brianna and I stood on our balcony, overlooking the ocean after our wedding, I reflected on how far I'd come, not just in my career, but as a person. The sting of my family's favoritism and manipulation had faded, replaced by a sense of clarity and gratitude. Success, I realized, wasn't just about proving people wrong. It was about building a life so rich, full, and authentic that their opinions no longer mattered. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt it in every fiber of my being. I was free. Their doubt and betrayal had been the foundation of my triumph, and now they could only watch my success from the sidelines.